At 41 years old, Nora Calloway had nothing left but a carpet bag, a winter coat that smelled of someone else's smoke, and $17 folded inside the lining of her left boot. The only place she had learned to hide things that truly mattered. The man who had taken everything else from her, her late husband's cattle concern, the deed to their land outside Beaumont Ridge, even the milk cow her daughter had named Clover, was a banker named Harlan Strett who had called the debt before the ink on the funeral ledger was even dry. She had walked out of the Beaumont Ridge courthouse in the autumn of 1887 into a wind that seemed to have no opinion of her suffering whatsoever, and she had walked east toward the sister town of Caldwell Spur, because east was the only direction that held no memory of what she had lost. It was there, in Caldwell Spur, that she spent 11 of her $17 on a thing that every sensible soul in the county had long since written off as worthless. A collapsed and blackened blacksmith's forge, sitting at the far end of a dead road on the edge of town, its roof half-caved, its chimney tilted like a man leaning against a wall he no longer trusted. The old-timers on the porch of the dry goods store shook their heads and called her foolish. One man called her worse than that. But beneath the floor of that ruined forge, sealed under the great iron anvil that had not moved in 11 years, something was waiting, not just for Nora Calloway, but for an entire town that had forgotten it was allowed to be whole again. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Nora Calloway. If you are watching from a place that feels forgotten, from a town or a life or a moment that the world seems to have looked past, tell us about it in the comments, because this story was made for you. 1. Along the main street without anyone paying her a salary for doing so, because in those years, what a woman knew was considered the natural extension of what her husband owned. Her father, a quiet Irishman named Colm Breslin, taught her to read iron the way a physician reads a face, to watch its color in the heat, to understand the difference between a rod that would yield and one that would crack, to feel in the hammer's rebound whether the metal beneath was telling the truth or holding something back. He had no sons. He seemed, in his wordless way, not to miss them. She was not a woman who worked the forge herself, not in the manner of full apprenticeship, but she understood the logic of the work from the inside out. She could assess a tool in seconds, name the grade of iron by its weight and its ring, and she had absorbed something beyond technique. She had absorbed her father's philosophy. Iron does not lie, he used to say. You can dress it up. You can plate it or paint it. But put heat to it, and it tells you exactly what it is. Her mother, Eileen Breslin, was the other half of her education. Eileen kept a ledger for the dry goods store, and one for the tannery, and one for the saddle maker who was, in private, terrible with numbers, but too vain to admit it. She taught Nora to read a balance sheet the way other mothers taught daughters to read hymnals, with reverence and with care, because the figures in those columns were not abstractions. Community could see about itself. These two educations, her father's hands and her mother's eyes, would lie dormant in her for years, the way seeds lie in ground that has not yet had rain. She married at 22, a decent and hard-working cattleman named Thomas Calloway, who was neither brilliant nor cruel, which she came to understand was a rare and undervalued combination in a husband. They had a daughter, Rosalind, bright and stubborn and able to argue a crow out of a cornfield. They built something together over 15 years, not wealth exactly, but weight, the substance of a life that has been tended, cattle on good land, a house that knew them, a name in Beaumont Ridge that meant something. Thomas died in the winter of 1885 of a lung fever that came on fast and stayed. He was 50 years old. Nora sat with him through the last 3 nights, her hand on his chest, feeling the labor of it, the terrible effort his body made to go on doing the one thing it had always done without thought. When it stopped, she did not weep immediately. She sat very still and listened to the silence of the room, because the silence of a room where someone has just died is different from any other silence, and she felt that she owed it her full attention. The trouble with Harlan Strett began 6 months after Thomas was in the ground, which was, she would later understand, precisely the amount of time a man like Strett calculated it would take for a grieving widow to be at her most disoriented and least defended. Thomas had borrowed against the land twice, once to repair the well after a bad summer, once to purchase 20 additional head of cattle that he had intended to sell before winter. He had not sold them. The note came due in February of 1886, and Nora had every intention of meeting it. She had the means, nearly, not quite, but nearly, and she went to the Beaumont Ridge Merchant Bank to speak plainly with Strett about a 30-day extension. Strett was a man who kept his office very clean. That was the detail Nora always remembered, The way there was nothing on his desk that did not belong there, not a speck of dust, not a stray pen, as though he had arranged the room to prove that disorder was a choice that lesser people made. He listened to her with his hands folded and his expression arranged into something that resembled patience, but was not. Then he told her the note was not extendable under the terms of the instrument she had signed. Which she had not signed, Thomas had signed, but her name was on the household, and so the law followed the house, and not the hand. She pushed back. She came back twice more. She brought her figures. She showed him the cattle count, the projected sale price, the 30-day gap between what she owed and what she would have. He was unmoved in the way that only men who have decided in advance are unmoved. Not because her argument was poor, but because her argument was irrelevant to what he had already decided to do. The foreclosure moved fast. Stret had a buyer waiting, which told her everything she needed to know about how long he had been waiting for this moment. The cattle went. The land went. The house went with the land. Rosalind, who was 19 by then and had recently married a decent young man in Galveston, begged her mother to come south. But Nora had watched her mother manage other people's books for 30 years and be thanked with nothing, and she had decided somewhere in the anger of that February that she would not spend the rest of her life in anyone's margin. She would find a place to stand. She took $17 from the household account before Stret's men came to inventory it. Technically it was hers, pocket money set aside from egg sales over the autumn, money that had never technically touched the note, and she walked out of Beaumont Ridge with her carpet bag and her coat and her boots with the money inside, and she did not look back, because looking back at a thing that has been taken from you is a way of letting it continue to take. Caldwell Spur in the autumn of 1887 was a town that had once believed in itself and had since thought better of it. It had been founded on the promise of a rail spur that had been rerouted 20 miles to the north in 1879, and the departure of that promise had taken with it the hotel, 2 of the 4 saloons, the land speculator who had platted out the residential streets, and the optimism that had been the town's most reliable currency. What remained was a handful of stubborn businesses, a church that was always either too hot or too cold, a school that was down to 1 teacher and 14 students, and approximately 200 people who had decided, for reasons as various as human nature, to stay. The forge at the end of Gannett Road had belonged to a blacksmith named Elias Drum, who had built it in 1871 and who had, in the opinion of people who had known him, been the best ironworker in the county for the better part of a decade. Drum had died in 1876 of causes that people in Caldwell Spur discussed in lowered voices and did not agree on. After his death, his wife had sold the equipment and moved to her sister's in Abilene, and the forge had sat empty ever since, growing into itself, the way empty buildings do, roof tiles sliding, mortar crumbling, weather finding every undefended seam until the structure became less a building and more a suggestion of one. Nora heard about it from the woman who ran the Caldwell Spur boarding house, a broad and forthright person named Mabel Otts, who mentioned it the way you mention a thing that is not worth mentioning. The old drum forge, sitting empty 11 years now. Nobody wants it. County tried to auction it twice. Went for nothing the first time and nothing the second. Nora asked the price. Mabel looked at her the way people look at someone who has asked a question that reveals a misunderstanding they had not expected to encounter. $11, she said. That's what the county deed office will take for it, just to clear the liability off the books. Nora walked to the deed office the next morning with $11 unfolded from the lining of her boot. The clerk, a young man whose suspenders did not match his ambitions, asked her twice if she understood what she was purchasing. She told him she understood iron better than he did. He stamped the deed. She walked to Gannett Road with $6 remaining. A deed in her carpet bag, and the particular feeling in her chest that she recognized from her father's shop as the moment just before you put the tongs in the fire, the moment that is equal parts commitment and uncertainty. The forge was worse than she had imagined. One wall had bowed outward from the weight of the sagging roof, and the chimney, which she had thought from a distance was merely leaning, was in fact cracked through the middle and held in place by nothing more than habit and dry mortar. The bellows had rotted to leather rags and sticks. The floor was packed earth that had heaved in the winters and contracted in the summers until it was ridged like a washboard. And in the center of the floor, on its mounting block of poured stone, sat the great black anvil of Elias Drum, a 200-pound tool with a face worn smooth as river glass, too heavy to sell, too heavy to move without equipment, too solid to be damaged by anything the years had thrown at it. It simply sat there, the most permanent thing in the room, as though it had decided to outlast everything and was making a patient success of it. Nora walked around it once, trailing her hand along the cold iron horn. It rang faintly under her fingers, that deep, satisfied note that a well-made anvil makes. the note that told her it was sound all the way through. She slept that night in Mabel Otts's boarding house and dreamed of nothing, which was the best dream she had had in 2 years. She came back to the forge the following morning with a broom she had borrowed, and she began to sweep. It was in the sweeping that she found the first thing. Pressed into the earth near the base of the anvil's mounting stone, just barely protruding from the soil, as though it had been working its way up for years, was the corner of what appeared to be a tin box, roughly the dimensions of a Bible. She worked it loose with a stick and then with her fingers, and when she pulled it free and pried the lid open, she found inside it a folded piece of oilcloth, and inside the oilcloth a single iron key, old and heavy, and a note written in a hand she did not yet know. The note said, "Beneath the stone, not for finders, for the one who stays." She did not know what to make of it. She held the key in her palm for a long time, feeling its weight, which was considerable for a key, substantial enough that whatever lock it had been made for was something worth locking. She read the note again. Not for finders, for the one who stays. Elias Drum had been dead 11 years. His wife had been gone 11 years. Whatever this key opened, it had been waiting in the ground beneath this anvil for 11 years, patient as the anvil itself. She began to examine the mounting stone more carefully. It was a poured block, roughly 2 feet square and 18 inches tall, set flush with the packed earth of the floor. But when she crouched and ran her hands along its base, she found that the south face of the stone was not solid. There was a gap, thin, barely a finger's width, between the base of the stone and the earth beneath it, and when she pressed her face close and angled her eyes, she could see that the gap extended inward into darkness. Not the darkness of packed earth, the darkness of open space. It took her the better part of 2 days to understand the mechanism. The anvil's mounting block was not simply poured concrete. It had been constructed, very deliberately, as the face of a concealed compartment, a small underground chamber, perhaps 4 feet deep and 4 feet across, accessible through a hatch in the floor on the north side that was covered by a section of fitted stone tile, mortared at the edges in a way that was indistinguishable from the surrounding floor unless you already knew to look. The lock for the hatch was recessed into the stone itself, nearly invisible. Nora's key fit it perfectly. What she found in the chamber below altered everything she thought she had come to Caldwell Spur to do. There were 3 things in the chamber. The first was a metal strongbox, locked, heavy enough when she tried to lift it that she understood it was not empty. The second was a rolled canvas wrapped in oilskin and tied with wire, which proved to be a detailed technical schematic of a piece of machinery she did not immediately recognize, but which bore the markings of a patent office submission, dated 1874, with the name Elias G. Drum written across the top in the same careful hand as the note. The third thing was a ledger, cloth-covered, its pages dense with figures and dates and names. It was the ledger that stopped her breath. She took it to Mabel Otts's boarding house that evening and sat at the kitchen table under the lamp and read it. It took her nearly 3 hours, because the entries were methodical and detailed, and she read each one twice to be certain she was understanding what she was reading. When she finished, she closed the ledger and sat in the lamplight for a long time, her hands flat on the cover, because the thing you do when you have just discovered something with weight is to stop and feel the weight before you move. Elias Drum had been keeping a record. From 1871 to 1876, for 5 years, he had recorded in this ledger every transaction he conducted with every business and private citizen in Caldwell Spur, not just his ironwork fees, but something else. He had been lending money, small amounts, quietly, to the businesses and families of Caldwell Spur in the years just after the rail spur had been rerouted and the bottom had fallen out of the town's future. He had lent to the school, twice. He had lent to the church. He had lent to the widow Packer to keep her millinery open, and to the Gruber brothers to replace a wagon wheel that stood between them and their last contract, and to at least 9 other families in amounts ranging from $4 to $30. And he had never called any of it due. The ledger showed partial repayments, and notes in the margin reading sufficient. Let remainder stand, and in the case of the school, a notation that simply read forgiven, dated Christmas 1874. The total outstanding came to $412. But the ledger also noted something else, in a careful column at the back. Against each borrower's name was a second entry, not a debt, but a credit. Services given. Fair return received. Drum had been tracking, in parallel, the value of what the community had given back to him. The meals brought when he was ill, the lumber donated for his roof, the afternoon that 6 men had shown up unasked to help him reset his chimney after a windstorm. He had tallied it all, and the tallies, when Nora added them, came within $12 of the outstanding loans. Elias Drum had known, precisely and without sentimentality, that the community of Caldwell Spur owed him nothing at all. He had been keeping the ledger not to collect, but to demonstrate, to himself, or perhaps to whoever came after, that the exchange had been fair, that they had been, in the oldest and most accurate sense, neighbors. The patent drawing she studied for a long time before she recognized it. An improved or separation apparatus, a device meant to refine iron or before smelting, with notes suggesting Drum had corresponded with a mining equipment manufacturer in Pittsburgh. A letter tucked in the rolled canvas's inner fold, dated 1875, expressed interest. And then nothing. Drum had died before the design went anywhere. The strongbox, which Nora eventually opened with a nail punch and a borrowed hammer. The lock was a simple lever mechanism, old and corroded, contained $422 in paper notes, 3 gold eagles, and a second letter, sealed, addressed in Drum's handwriting to the holder of this key, if ever there should be one. She opened it with careful hands and read it by lamplight. "I am not long for this," Drum had written. "I have no heirs, and I have asked God to forgive the cowardice of that fact. What is here is not mine in any way that death does not cancel. It belongs to this town, to the school first, which is a lamp in a dark room and ought not to go out, to any family that is behind, to the church if the roof needs fixing, and I believe it does. I have asked only that it go to the one who stays, not the one who comes to take, not the one who speculates, but whoever comes and works and means to put this place back together. I trust they will know themselves when they read this." Nora sat with the letter for a long time. Then she went to sleep, because the next day was going to require her to be steady. She went to Harlan Strett before she went to anyone in Caldwell Spur, not because Strett was involved in any of this. He was not, but because she had learned in the months since losing her home that men like Strett understood only one kind of authority, legal clarity, produced on paper, in the presence of witnesses. She went first to the county seat, a town called Mercer's Flat, where she found a lawyer named August Teal, who was expensive for his experience, but cheap for his honesty. She laid out for him the deed to the forge, the key, the ledger, the patent drawing, the strongbox contents, and Drum's letter. She asked him what was legally hers and what was not. He studied it all for 2 hours. He told her the strongbox money and the patent. If the patent could be revived or licensed, which was uncertain but not impossible, were likely legally hers by virtue of the deed and the intent expressed in the letter. He told her the ledger debts had long since been unenforceable. He told her the letter was a moral instrument, not a legal one, but that she could do with the money whatever she chose. She chose what Drum had asked, but before she did, she made one other visit. She wrote a letter to the Pittsburgh manufacturer whose name appeared on the patent correspondence, explaining that she held Drum's design and asking whether any interest remained. The reply came 6 weeks later. Interest had not only remained. The manufacturer had developed a variant of the design independently, which they had been quietly profitable with for 8 years. They were, the letter said with notable circumspection, open to a conversation about licensing the original in order to avoid a dispute as to prior art. August Teal handled the negotiation. Nora sat in his office on the day the agreement was reached and did not allow herself to show anything on her face, because the number on the paper was large enough that showing anything on her face would have undermined the dignity she needed to carry everything that came next. What came next began with opposition from a man named Curtis Whale. Curtis Whale was the closest thing Caldwell Spur had to a property broker, though his actual occupation was more accurately described as a man who positioned himself between any transaction and a percentage of it. He had known for years about the Drum Forge, had in fact been the one to recommend the auction price of $11 to the county clerk, on the basis that no one would offer more. When word got around Caldwell Spur that the widow who had bought the forge had found something inside it, and that she was apparently in correspondence with a lawyer in Mercer's Flat and a manufacturer in Pittsburgh, Whale began to take a pointed interest in Nora Calloway's affairs. He came to the forge on a Tuesday morning while she was supervising 2 men she had hired to straighten the chimney, and paid them to stop working, loudly enough that she could hear. And then he came inside and stood looking around with the expression of a man reevaluating an investment he had previously dismissed. He told her, pleasantly, that he had always had an interest in the Drum property. He told her that he had the connections and the capital to develop it properly. Whereas a woman alone, he paused here, to let the phrase carry its full implication, might find herself in over her head. He suggested a partnership. His word, his smile, and the flat quality of his eyes told her exactly what kind of partnership it was. The kind in which he ended up with the thing, and she ended up with the gratitude of having been included. She listened to all of it. She let him finish. Then she told him she would think on it. She went back to August Teal, and she told him exactly what Whale had said. Teal nodded as though he had expected it. He asked her whether the deed was clean. She told him the deed was clean. He told her that was all she needed. But Whale was not finished. He went to the county assessor and raised a challenge to the sale, arguing that the forge had been improperly priced and that the county had erred in selling it below assessed value. He found two men in Caldwell Spur willing to say, in writing, that they had intended to bid on the property but had not been properly notified of the sale, though no such notification was required by law for tax relief auctions. He began speaking in the saloon about the question of what a stranger could rightfully claim from a community's history, and the word stranger was a deliberate choice, because Nora Calloway had not been born in Caldwell Spur, had not known Elias Drum, had no history there that could be invoked. The town had not yet decided what it thought about Nora Calloway. She had been there 2 months. She worked hard, and she did not ask for much, and she was unfailingly polite. But she was a widow from another county who had bought a ruin for $11 and seemed to know something that nobody else knew, which made people in small towns not trusting, because small towns understand, at the cellular level, that what one person knows that others don't can be either a gift or a weapon. Mabel Otts, who had lived in Caldwell Spur for 30 years and whose opinion was the closest thing the town had to a public conscience, had formed a view of Nora Calloway early and not yet revised it. She was a woman who had been knocked down hard and had gotten up still holding her tools, which was as much as Mabel Otts asked of anyone. But Mabel's goodwill was not votes, and Whale's challenge was working. The assessor scheduled a hearing. Nora spent the 3 weeks before the hearing in a state of outward calm that she maintained the way you maintain a high-built fire, by constant, quiet attention. She went to the deed office and she made copies of every document. She went back to the forge every day and kept working, because whatever happened at the hearing, she intended the building to be sound, because a building that is sound argues for itself. And she began, quietly, to visit the people in Elias Drum's ledger. She did not go to them with the ledger open. She did not go as a creditor or a claimant. She went the way her mother had gone to the businesses she kept books for, with attention, with directness, and without theater. She went to the school first, because Drum had said so, and she sat with the schoolteacher, a young woman named Clara Finch who was 26 and already tired in the way of people who were doing 3 jobs and being paid for half of one. She told Clara Finch that she had found records from a man named Elias Drum suggesting that he had left something for this school, and she wanted to understand what the school needed before she decided how to act. Clara Finch looked at her for a long moment. Then she opened the bottom drawer of her desk and took out a list she had clearly been keeping for some time, in the manner of people who make lists of things they cannot have, because it is the only control they can exercise over wanting them. The list included primers, a replacement globe, wood for the stove through the end of February, and Clara touched the last item on the list with one finger, very briefly, like someone touching a bruise, a second teacher. Nora took the list. She folded it carefully. She thanked Clara Finch, and she left. She went to the widow Packer, who was 73 now and still ran the millinery from a room in her house, because the original shop had closed. She went to the Gruber brothers, who were 50 now and whose wagon business had survived, but only barely. She went to 5 other families, and she listened, and she made notes in the margin of her own small notebook in a hand that would have reminded her mother of the way she had always written figures, precise and unhurried, because figures that are hurried are figures that are wrong. The hearing came on a Friday in December. Nora arrived with August Teal and a stack of documents that they arranged on the table in front of them with the calm of people who are not worried about what they have brought. Whale arrived with his 2 witnesses and a self-assurance that read, to Nora, as the particular confidence of a man who has won this kind of thing before and cannot imagine the mechanism failing now. The assessor ran the hearing in the front room of the county courthouse in Mercer's flat. Teal presented the deed, the sale record, the county's own documentation of the auction process. He presented the legal opinion on the strongbox and the patent. He presented Drum's letter. He presented a statement from the Pittsburgh manufacturer confirming the licensing agreement, which was, by the date of the hearing, already signed and in effect. When Whale's witnesses made their claim about not having been notified, Teal produced the county's own published notice from the Mercer's Flat Courier, dated 6 weeks before the sale, in which the drum forge was listed by address. One of the witnesses, under questioning by the assessor, admitted he did not take the courier. The other admitted he had not bid at the first auction either. The assessor dismissed the challenge before noon. Nora walked out into the December light and took a breath of cold air that tasted, to her, like the air after a storm has passed, clean and direct and full of space. She came back to Caldwell Spur that afternoon, and she asked Mabel Otts to put the word out that she wanted to meet with anyone who had known Elias Drum. 14 people came to the boarding house parlor on Saturday morning. The surviving members of the families from the ledger, Clara Finch, the minister of the church, a man who had been drum's apprentice for one summer when he was 17. They sat in the room with their coffee cups and their wariness, and Nora told them what she had found. She told them plainly. She told them about the ledger and the chamber and the strongbox and the letter. She told them about the patent and the licensing agreement. She told them she had read the ledger carefully, and she wanted them to understand what it said, that Elias Drum had not died a creditor. He had died an accountant of human decency, and his books had balanced. And then she told them what she intended to do. The school received its primers and its stove wood and its second teacher, a salary guaranteed for 2 years from the licensing proceeds. The church roof was repaired before Christmas. 3 families received amounts that allowed them to clear debts that had been slowly taking the light out of their daily lives. And one of those families was the widow Packer, who sat in her chair with the envelope in her lap and said nothing for a long moment, and then said only, Elias always was stubborn about settling up. Nora kept $300. She kept it not as profit, but as the cost of what she intended to build. She hired 2 men for 3 months, and she rebuilt the drum forge from the foundation up. Straight chimney, new bellows, repaired walls, sound roof. She did not intend to work iron herself, not primarily, but she had learned from her father that a forge is not a building. A forge is a statement. A forge in a small town means that the town believes in its own future enough to keep the fire going. She hired a young blacksmith named Perry Aldis, who had been working out of a tent on the edge of town because he had no shop, and she offered him a lease arrangement that her mother would have recognized as fair, the kind of numbers that told the truth about both parties. Perry Aldis accepted the terms and moved his family into the house next door and had the forge burning within a week. Caldwell Spur, which had been forgetting how to believe in itself for the better part of a decade, noticed. Towns notice when someone puts a fire back in a building that has been cold for 11 years. It is not a small thing. Curtis Whale left Caldwell Spur in the early spring of 1888. He gave a story about an opportunity in another county, which was the kind of story that is true in the way that all incomplete stories are true. The fuller truth, which most people in town understood without saying, was that a man whose influence depends on being the one who knows the price of things cannot long survive in a place where someone has demonstrated that some things are beyond his valuation. He was not punished. He was simply made irrelevant, which is, for a man like Whale, the more thorough justice. And so we come back to where we began, a woman of 41, walking east from everything she had lost, with $17 in the lining of her boot, and the kind of silence inside her that comes not from having nothing to say, but from having learned to choose very carefully the things worth saying. She had known iron since childhood. She had known figures. She had known that value does not announce itself, that it waits. In the earth under a ruined floor, in a letter sealed against the wrong hands, in a ledger that has been patient for 11 years because it knows the right reader will eventually come. What Nora Calloway understood, in a way that neither Harlan Strett nor Curtis Whale ever did, was that overlooked things are not worthless things. They are simply things that have been waiting for someone with the eyes to see them. She spent the autumn of 1888 setting up a small accounting practice out of the forge building's front room, and she kept the books for half the businesses in Caldwell Spur, as her mother had done for 30 years in a town 200 miles west, and she was paid a salary because times had changed enough for that, and because Nora Calloway had changed enough to ask for one. Rosalind came up from Galveston that Christmas with her husband and her new daughter, a small and red-faced person named Eileen, after the grandmother she would only ever know through stories. Nora held the baby in the front room of the forge and felt the weight of her, which was the new, sweet, uncomplicated kind of weight, the kind that does not need to be interpreted, only held. The anvil stood in the center of the forge, exactly where Elias Drum had left it. Perry Aldis worked around it every day, the hammer ringing off its worn face with a sound that carried to the street, and then to the school, and then, on a still morning, all the way to the edge of town. The sound of iron being made honest, the sound of a community remembering what it was made of. Nora heard it from her desk every morning. She never stopped hearing it as beautiful. They mocked her for restoring the crumbling forge, people would say in later years, when the story had become the kind of story that a town tells about itself to remember who it decided to be. And what did she find? They always smiled when they said it. Because they knew. Because the answer was not just a chamber, not just a strongbox, not just a patent that turned into money and money that turned into a school and a roof and a fire burning in a building that had been dark for 11 years. The answer was that Elias Drum had never really left. He had just been waiting, the way iron waits, for the heat that would prove what it was made of. And Nora Calloway, who had been written off and pushed out and told that she had nothing left, had walked east into a cold autumn and put her hand to the forge, and the forge had rung true. Thank you so much for spending this time with us today. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to be reminded that overlooked things are rarely worthless. They are simply waiting for the right pair of eyes. And before you go, we would love to hear from you. What is a time in your own life when you found real value in something others had completely written off? Tell us in the comments. We read every one, and your stories matter to us more than you know. If you enjoyed this telling, subscribing to the channel means you will never miss another story, and every bell notification is a little like pulling up a chair to a fire that is always burning for you. We will be back soon with another story of quiet courage and overlooked worth. Until next time, stay close.